You know that point in a DIY project where you look at your hands and wonder if the grime is permanently bonded to your soul? Well, imagine trying to scrub all that off for the fanciest wedding Chicago has ever seen, because that was exactly my situation. I'm Martha, 68, widow, and owner of a small chicken farm back home in Shelby County, Tennessee. And when I say small, I mean big enough to keep me busy from dawn till dusk, but small enough that I know every hen by name. Now, I love my roots, but somehow I ended up in this Chicago hotel lobby that looked more like the inside of a polished diamond than a building. Seriously, I'm pretty sure the marble on the floor costs more than my entire 20-acre spreads. I was there for my niece, Amber. Amber is a sweetheart, really she is, but 5 years in the city had changed her. She used to love getting her hands dirty gathering eggs with me, but now she designs graphics and drinks coffee blacker than my tractor tires and uses words like artisanal to describe cheese. But family is family, and you show up for family when they get hitched. So, I went all in on the fixins. I bought myself a navy blue silk dress off the clearance rack that honestly makes me look a decade younger, if I do say so myself. I got my hair curled and hairsprayed into submission. I could probably walk through a Category 3 hurricane right now, and not a single strand would dare to shift an inch. I even put on makeup, though my grandma always used to tell me powder and paint only make a mule look acceptable, not like a racehorse. I looked respectable, which was the whole goal. As I stepped into the cocktail party venue, I was met with blinding glitz. There were glass walls and steel beams, and a grand piano playing a tune that sounded exactly like someone dropping a handful of quarters into a bottle. It was overwhelming, and I just kept telling myself, don't spill anything, don't trip, and for heaven's sake, just smile. The room was packed with people talking about things I didn't understand, wearing clothes that looked terribly uncomfortable. I scanned the crowd, feeling like a catfish in a goldfish bowl, when I spotted it. The welcome table, dominated by a flower arrangement the size of my tractor tires. This is where I needed to be, the first true hurdle, finding that little card that said I belonged. In front of the flowers were neat rows of name tags, the fancy kind made of thick, sparkling cardstock and covered in calligraphy. I started searching under M for Martha, then H for Higgins, trying to maintain my composure. Nothing. I was starting to sweat under my hairspray. Just when I thought about retreating to the bathroom, a young woman approached me. She was chic in a black jumpsuit and had that look of professional organization. "Can I help you find your tag, ma'am?" she asked, her smile smooth and polished like new linoleum. I managed to smile back. "Yes, thank you. I'm Martha Higgins, the bride's aunt." She quickly checked a list on a tablet, then looked at me with a smile that felt a little too practiced, like it was covering up something else. "Oh, Aunt Martha," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Your tag is set aside in a special area. The bride had a very specific request for yours." "A special request?" Well, maybe the girl hadn't forgotten me after all. Maybe it was something sentimental, something just for family. I followed the planner over to a smaller table tucked away in the far corner, away from the main display. There, sitting all by itself, was one single name tag. I adjusted my reading glasses, picked up the thick card, and read what was written in that beautiful, glittering script. Clear as day, it read, "Country Bumpkin Old Lady." It felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the room. The young planner still had that smooth, linoleum floor smile pasted on, her eyes darting from the tag in my hand to my face, then back again. My mouth had gone as dry as the clay after a 10-day Shelby County drought, and my stomach did a little flip that felt uncomfortably like those molecular dishes Amber always talked about. Was this a joke? Was it just for her friends? Was this how she really saw me? The phrase country bumpkin wasn't new. Lord knows I'd heard it often enough from folks who thought city slickness equaled smarts. To them, we were just simple people with dirty nails and a slow drawl, folks who probably couldn't count past 10 without using their toes. But I was Martha. I ran a farm. I paid my taxes. I raised 2 kids on my own after my husband passed. There was nothing bumpkin about it. The word felt like a slap, a dismissal of everything I was and everything we were. And I was standing here in my best clearance silk dress, feeling like the punchline to a very expensive, glitzy joke. My first instinct, the one with the dirty boots and the practical sense, wanted to take that sparkling card, rip it into pieces, and throw it at the grand piano. The American woman in me, the one who doesn't take guff from anyone, wanted to do that. But the proud part of me, the part that wouldn't give Amber or any of her chic, uncomfortable clothes-wearing friends the satisfaction of seeing me break, had a different plan. I folded that perfect, calligraphy-covered insult, slowly, precisely, into a neat little square. I didn't want to humiliate Susan, Amber's mom, or ruin anyone's day, so I slipped it into my purse. No one else needed to know. I adjusted my dress and my smile, took a deep breath that felt more like a grunt, and started moving into the sea of people. I made my way to the cocktail bar, ordered a glass of lemonade, and found the table with Martha Higgins simply printed on it. My mind, though, was a whirlwind. How did we get here? From the little girl who picked eggs to this woman who labeled her own aunt in calligraphy? Amber could live with her fear that her roots would somehow tarnish her perfect Chicago life. I was done with that. A year before, her husband had called my own son a nobody, and I had let that slide, but not this time. Dignity isn't always loud, but sometimes it starts with a changed password, a phone placed face down, and a changed plan. The music swelled, signaling the start of the ceremony. Lights dimmed, focusing attention on the far end of the room where the grand view of Chicago's skyline at dusk provided the backdrop. As Amber floated down the aisle, a vision in expensive white lace, I felt a familiar squeeze in my heart, remembering the little girl with scraped knees and chicken feathers in her hair. It was hard to reconcile that child with the sophisticated woman standing before us, exchanging vows filled with promises of honor and respect. Listening to those carefully scripted words, my hand inevitably strayed back to my purse. Through the silk lining, I could trace the sharp edge of that folded name tag, a constant, scratching reminder of the reality beneath the glitz. Here she was, promising to honor her husband, while privately labeling her own aunt as something to be ashamed of. I looked around at the chic crowd, wondering how many of them would disappear like dew in the morning sun if they actually knew what it meant to work from dawn till dusk to put food on a table. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to recall that other Amber, the one not afraid of mud on her boots. But when I opened them, the stranger was still there, smiling a perfectly designed smile for the cameras. As the ceremony concluded and the cocktail hour resumed, waiters circulated with tiny, unpronounceable appetizers. One approached me with a tray of delicate pastries. I looked at that perfect little hors d'oeuvre, then looked the waiter square in the eye. My hand did not reach for the purse this time, but I raised my chin just an inch, a silent defiance in my clearance silk dress. "No, thank you," I said, my voice clear and steady in the ambient noise of piano and polite conversation. I didn't need their approval. I certainly didn't need their tiny pastries, and I was finished feeling small in a room that didn't know the difference between a country road and a gilded cage. The cocktail hour blurred into a seated dinner in another cavernous, sparkling room, and I found my table. It wasn't in the far corner like that first little welcome table, but it was definitely far enough from the main event to feel like I was watching a high school play through the wrong end of some binoculars. I sat down next to cousins I hadn't seen in 30 years, folks who had been polished into something totally unrecognizable, smelling like expensive department store counters instead of sun and sweat. Before the salads were even served, my sister Susan buzzed by. Susan had moved to the city 30 years ago, worked hard to drop every bit of the southern drawl, and now owned a successful real estate firm. She looked immaculate but stressed, her eyes darting around the room to make sure everything was perfect. "Martha," she said, squeezing my shoulder but not looking me in the eye. "It's so good you made it. Isn't Amber beautiful?" She spent a literal year planning every tiny detail. A year planning every tiny detail. Those words hung in the air like humidity right before a July thunderstorm. If every single detail was planned, then that included the handwriting on that glittering card tucked deep in my purse. I felt a flush creeping up my neck, that heat that starts just before you blow your top, but I held it together. I just gave her a tight smile. "Yes, she is beautiful, Susan. You must be very proud," I said, keeping my voice as level as a 10-acre cornfield on a calm afternoon. Susan didn't even wait for me to finish the sentence. She was already buzzing off to the next table, a blur of silk and anxiety. I picked up my salad fork, feeling the internal pressure gauge rising, and knew I had to stick to the new plan. Dinner was served, and it was some kind of fancy fish topped with a foam that looked more like soapy dishwater than food and smelled faintly like mud. I looked at the 3 different forks lined up like soldiers next to my plate, remembering when I had to use a tire iron to pry a stubborn rock out of my tractor tread last month. I bet not a soul in this room knew how to do anything with their hands other than type on a keyboard or sign a check. One of the polished cousins leaning into my space, smelling of expensive mint and too much gin, asked with a patronizing chuckle, "So, you live on a farm? Is that sanitary?" I forced my jaw shut tight enough to crack a tooth. It's as sanitary as life needs to be when you're actually creating something of value, I told him, not bothering to paste on a smile this time. Then, the toast started. Clinking champagne flutes and artificial smiles filled the cavernous room as Amber's husband got up to speak. He talked about Amber's incredible rise to sophistication, how Chicago had shaped her into the definition of chic, how she'd left behind anything and anyone who couldn't keep up. The room applauded, a polite, expensive noise that made me feel empty. I sat there, my stomach empty from the mudfish, but my heart heavy with a different kind of hunger. I thought about the time Amber, at 7 years old, had cried because a hawk snatched a tiny yellow chick, how I'd held her until the tears stopped and taught her about the hard circle of life. I realized then that she'd spent 5 years trying to paint over that girl with a thick brush of snobbery, and that I was just part of the old, rough which she wanted to cover up. I glanced over at Amber, sparkling under the chandelier like that fancy calligraphy, and she looked right through me. That was it. My hand didn't go for the purse this time, but I reached down and picked my purse up off the floor and put it on my lap. I sat a little straighter, not for her, but for me, and decided that when I walked out of here, I was walking towards something real, something useful, and I was never going to apologize for the grime. Under my fingernails again. The waiters cleared the last of the muddy fish plates as the band cranked up the volume, shifting from smooth jazz to something that sounded like a bunch of robots arguing in an echo chamber. Everyone started buzzing again, the expensive mint and gin scent thickening the air as folks began drifting toward the dance floor. I watched them, these people who spent a year planning details that didn't matter, and felt that heavy internal pressure gauge finally settle into a calm, steady resolve. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. I picked up my purse, my fingers brushing against the edge of that folded card one more time, not in anger, but in finality. I needed a polite exit, because Martha Higgins wasn't a coward, even if she was apparently a bumpkin. I spotted my sister Susan near the edge of the room, still directing traffic like she was conducting a 3-ring circus, looking tighter than a drum on a hot day. I walked up to her, not rushing, not feeling small. "Susan," I said, pitching my voice just loud enough to carry over the synthetic bass line. It was a lovely event. I've said my prayers for Amber and her new husband. Susan looked at me, her eyes widening slightly as she took in my resolute posture, probably surprised I hadn't already slipped out earlier. She paused, just for a second, almost seeing her sister instead of the micromanaging agent she had become. Then the mask slid back into place. "Oh, Martha, you aren't leaving? Amber hasn't even cut the cake. It's artisanal vanilla bean imported from somewhere expensive." Imported vanilla bean, another detail. I smiled, a genuine, easy smile that didn't feel practiced in the slightest. "Yes, Susan, I imagine it is fancy. But I've had my fill of artisanal and fancy for a lifetime. It's time I get back to things I know." I turned and walked away, past the tables of unfinished wine and the crowd of people dancing without looking at each other. I didn't stop to look for Amber. She wouldn't have noticed me anyway. I walked through the glitzy lobby, past the marble that cost more than my farm, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The Chicago night air hit me, a blast of cool, damp exhaust that felt surprisingly refreshing after the sterile, expensive perfume inside. I walked down the street toward the hotel garage, the echo of my heels on the pavement a steady, useful sound. Shelby County was 20 acres of grime, sweat, clean dirt, and honesty, and I couldn't wait to feel the actual ground beneath my boots again. The elevator ride up to my hotel room was quiet, thank goodness, with no more perfume-drenched cousins or pretentious cocktail chatter. Stepping into the sterile, cool hallway on the 20th floor felt like crossing a border between 2 different countries. Inside my room, I stood before the mirror and didn't wait even a single minute before reaching around and yanking that zipper on my navy clearance silk dress. Shedding that dress felt better than any high-end spa treatment probably ever could. It was like stripping away a layer of falsehood I'd been wearing for hours. I hung it up in the closet. It did its job, but I was done pretending. I scrubbed that expensive makeup off my face until my skin felt clean again, then tackled my hair, which took nearly half a bottle of conditioner and some serious persistence to wash out all that cement like hairspray, but I didn't mind the effort. Finally, I slipped into my favorite, worn-out cotton pajamas, the ones with the faded floral pattern that smelled faintly of Shelby County sunshine and lavender detergent. That was better. I was me again. I walked over to my suitcase and started packing, folding my clothes with the same methodical, useful precision I used when stacking hay or crating eggs. No artful draping here, just utility. Then, I remembered my purse. I opened it and reached down to the very bottom, my fingers closing around that stiff, folded name tag. I pulled it out and stared at it under the harsh, white hotel lamp. Country Bumpkin Old Lady. The calligraphy still glittered, but the words had lost their sting. They didn't describe me. They described the person who wrote them, the person too scared of real, honest dirt to own her own history. I didn't want this artifact of shame in my life, not one more second. I took that sparkling card and tore it right down the middle. Then I tore it again and again, making tiny, glittering snowflakes of that meticulous insult until it was nothing but useless scraps that I dropped right into the wastebasket by the desk. I was finished with that name, with that judgment, and with this whole hollow charade. I looked out the massive hotel window at the twinkling Chicago skyline one last time, majestic but cold. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, the cicadas were singing their nightly song in the Tennessee dark, and the smell of the damp earth was waiting for me. I was leaving first thing in the morning, trading imported vanilla bean cake for hard work and honesty, and I couldn't wait. The next morning, the sun was barely peeking over those towering skyscrapers, looking more like a weak yellow light bulb than a magnificent sunrise. I was up long before my alarm, my body clock still firmly set on farm time, completely unbothered by that fancy imported vanilla bean cake schedule. I was packed and checked out of that sanitized hotel room in under 10 minutes, not wanting to waste another second in a place that made me feel so foreign. I drove my old Ford truck out of the valet line. Thank goodness those young fellas hadn't figured out how to scratch it, and got myself pointed south on the interstate. Chicago traffic, even on a Sunday morning, is a special kind of frantic mess, but once I got outside that outer loop, the concrete finally started to give way to rolling green fields. Crossing that state line into Indiana was like shedding a heavy winter coat in early spring, just a pure sense of physical relief washing over me. I drove all day, covering hundreds of miles of flat, honest farmland that looked useful, not just decorated. The steady hum of my truck's engine a far sight more comforting than that electronic argued robot music. I ate a gas station sandwich for lunch and drank bad coffee, and it tasted better than that muddy fish foam simply because I knew exactly what it was. By the time I crossed into Tennessee, the sun was already starting to dip low, painting the sky in real gold and purple, colors you couldn't buy in a fancy Chicago store no matter how much marble they had on the floor. I pulled off the main highway and onto the county roads, the pavement soon turning to that familiar gravel that crunching under my tires sounded like home. As I turned into my own gravel driveway, the smell of damp earth, pine trees, and Shelby County humidity hit me through the open window, a sweet, honest perfume that immediately erased all that artificial scent from the weekend. I stopped the truck and just sat there for a minute, listening to the real symphony of cicadas cranking up their nightly song in the oaks and the distant, familiar sound of my hens settling in for the night. I wasn't just Martha the old lady. I was Martha Higgins, the useful, capable owner of this whole, grime-covered, sweat-soaked, honest, beautiful life, and I was home. I stepped down out of my Ford truck, and my feet hit that gravel drive with a solid crunch that just made sense. The humidity in the air was thick enough to wear, a far sight better than that sterile hotel breeze, carrying the honest sense of damp pine needles and the coupe. I didn't even bother carrying my suitcase into the house. I headed straight for the mudroom connected to the barn. Within 5 minutes, I'd kicked off those flats that always hurt my feet and slid into my oldest, muddiest pair of lace-up work boots. the ones with the worn-down treads that fit my feet like a second skin. I walked out toward the main chicken coop, the sun now fully up, painting the whole sky a gorgeous, soft orange that you couldn't buy in any city store. The girls were already awake and ready, their clucking a welcome chorus that made me feel more grounded than any artisanal imported vanilla bean cake ever could. I reached into a 50-pound bag of layer feed, grabbed in a scoop, that dry, earthy smell hitting my nose. I scattered that feed, watching them peck and scramble, a useful, simple routine that was 100 times more satisfying than watching folks dance to argued robot music. Grime immediately found its way back under my fingernails as I reached into a nesting box and pulled out a single, warm brown egg, smooth and heavy in my palm. It was the first one of the day. Useful. Honest. I stood there, covered in Rayall, Tennessee dirt, and I just smiled, thinking about that glittering calligraphy scrap sitting in a trash can thousands of miles away. It didn't matter what names Amber or her fancy friends wanted to call me, because I knew, without a doubt, that this life here was real, and it was exactly where Martha Higgins belonged. I carried that warm brown egg back to the house, nestling it in a wire basket on the kitchen counter next to the others I'd gather soon, making a pot of real, strong coffee. None of that fancy city stuff that tastes like hot water and pretense. I watched the steam rise and felt the familiar ache in my shoulders from yesterday's long drive settling down, replaced by the good kind of tiredness you get from honest work. I walked out to the garden patch with my mug, the grass still heavy with morning dew that soaked right through my boot leather, but I didn't mind one bit. My tomatoes were heavy on the vine, needing staking before the next big thunderstorm rolled through, and the zucchini were growing faster than gossip in a small town. I spent the next 2 hours sweating under the gathering sun, driving wooden stakes into the damp soil with a 5-pound sledgehammer, my muscles burning but useful, each swing a declaration that I was capable and right where I belonged. I thought briefly about that fancy wedding cake, imported and untouched by rough hands, and just chuckled to myself as grime coated my forearms and the smell of tomato leaves and rich loam filled my lungs. Later that morning, my neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, pulled up in his truck to dump a load of fresh manure for my compost pile, a trade for 2 dozen eggs that made more sense to me than any of Amber's abstract graphics contracts ever would. We talked for 20 minutes, leaning against the bed of his truck, discussing the price of diesel and the upcoming weather, a simple, direct conversation that contained more honesty than every polished toast in Chicago combined. After old Mr. Henderson drove off, leaving that load of rich manure and the smell of honest work behind, I headed back into the house with that wire basket of warm brown eggs tucked under my useful, grime-covered arm. It was nearly lunchtime, and my stomach was growling in that useful, demanding way that comes from spending your morning driving stakes and talking sense instead of just decorating. I decided right then that I wasn't making anything fancy, just some simple scrambled eggs and a couple of buttermilk biscuits, the real kind made with actual lard and a pinch of love, a far cry from that muddy fish foam that cost more than my entire 20-acre spread. I worked methodically in my 50-year-old kitchen, grease pops on the old stove a comforting sound as I cracked those fresh eggs, knowing exactly where they came from and what went into them. Sitting there at my worn wooden table, eating food I'd basically grown or raised myself, I thought briefly about Susan and Amber back in Chicago. They probably hadn't even finished cataloging all their gifts yet. Or maybe they were arguing over which artisanal imported vanilla bean cake scrap went into which fancy recycling bin. I realized then that my sister Susan hadn't just moved 30 years ago. She had escaped what she saw as a life of grime, traded her southern drawl for a slick elevator speech, and raised a daughter to do the same, completely blind to the hollow center of that trade. They were missing out on the joy of staking a tomato vine and seeing it hold against a thunderstorm, on the usefulness of a handshake agreement over a contract written in confusing graphics. I was done with that, though, done feeling small because they needed a gilded cage to feel big. The grime was back under my nails, and that solid Tennessee gravel drive was waiting for me outside, and that was exactly how Martha Higgins planned on living out her useful, beautiful life. The following weekend, I found myself back in that mudroom, but this time I was yanking that zipper on my navy clearance silk dress again. No, I wasn't pretending for another wedding. I was heading to the county feed store to pick up 2 dozen 50-pound bags of starter and a new shovel handle to replace the one I'd finally cracked on a stubborn oak root. I didn't need to condition my hair or spray it into a cement helmet this time. I just threw it up in a messy ponytail, grabbed my worn leatherwork gloves, and slipped into those muddy work boots that fit like old friends. As I drove my Ford truck down that gravel driveway toward the main highway, the smell of Rayall, Tennessee humidity and damp pine needles filled the cab through the open window, 100 times more satisfying than any imported vanilla bean scent or high-end perfume. I pulled into the feed store lot, and the young fellow working the counter didn't look at my truck like he was inspecting a scratches waiting to happen puzzle. He just gave me a steady, respect and nod. We talked for 10 minutes about the price of corn and how the upcoming 100-degree days would affect the hens laying. A useful, honest conversation that contained more substance than every polite toast and fake smile in Chicago. Later that afternoon, as I stood covered in honest sweat, hozzing the grime off my forearms after stacking all that feed myself, I thought back to Susan's expensive department store smell and Amber's empty, sparkling graphics contracts. They were welcome to their sanitized, hollow life of decor and pretense. Martha Higgins didn't need a golden cage to feel valuable, and she certainly didn't need a twinkling calligraphy label to tell her who she was. I reached down into the rich loam of my useful garden patch, pulled a heavy, red tomato off the vine, and took a big, satisfying bite. The real taste of home explosion in my mouth, grime under my useful fingernails, and Shelby County dark settling down around me. And that was exactly how I knew I was right where I belonged.